In the shimmering steel heights of Chicago, David Carter's penthouse soared above the sleepless city, a glass and marble fortress that belonged to someone who had everything and nothing at all. David, the man behind half the city's billboards, sat alone at his vast desk, the skyline flickering in the background like a pulse he no longer felt. Every corner of his home gleamed. Every inch was curated by interior designers, dusted by silent housekeepers, polished by invisible hands. But none of it made a difference. Nothing softened the silence. In one wing of the penthouse, behind a heavy oak door, Noah Carter's world unfolded in darkness. 11 years old, bone-thin, skin pale as moonlight, Noah moved with careful, listening steps. His mother's absence was still everywhere. On the unused piano, in the faded family photos, in the quiet that crept along the hallways at dusk. He'd lost his sight the night she died. A single, brutal accident that left one seat forever empty and one boy wandering through endless night. David filled the emptiness with work. He bought the most expensive adaptive tools for Noah, hired tutors who quoted Harvard and MIT, filled the apartment with every luxury except his own presence. When he did appear, it was as a shadow in the doorway, voice curt, eyes fixed on a tablet or phone. "Noah, breakfast," he'd say, already halfway down his emails. "Noah, your lesson's at 10. Never a question. Never time to listen. Some nights Noah would press his hands against the cool window and imagine what Chicago looked like in color. He remembered flashes, his mother's laughter, the orange spill of sunlight in the park, the sparkling blue of Lake Michigan. But now his world was textures and sounds, the drone of distant traffic, the soft beep of his computer, the echo of shoes on marble that always signaled David, never his mother. On good days, Noah constructed intricate towers out of tactile blocks, or listened to audiobooks that swept him into magical worlds far from this cold palace. On bad days, the walls felt too close, the quiet too heavy, and every memory felt like a cut that never healed. David believed he was doing his best. He told himself it was noble to provide, to conquer markets, to set up trust funds. But what Noah needed most, a father's hand, a patient ear, was always out of reach. Tonight, as city lights flickered far below, David worked late in his study, fingers flying over numbers and code. Somewhere down the hall, a lamp clicked off. Noah sat on his bed, listening to the hush that pressed against the windows. His heart ached with a loneliness that words couldn't reach. He whispered into the dark, soft, so soft even the wind might have missed it. "I just want Dad to look at me. Just once." Rain hammered the city that evening, glazing the penthouse windows with shimmering streaks. David, pressured by a vague sense of fatherly duty, announced that he and Noah would eat out. No explanation, no warmth, just the brief final word of a CEO used to instant compliance. Noah braced himself in the elevator, counting the seconds as the city spun around him in muted, shapeless color. He followed the sharp click of David's shoes, his own feet shuffling over the marble lobby, then the rumble of the town car across wet Chicago streets. In the back seat, Noah pressed his palm to the glass, the world outside a rush of sound and rain. David sat rigid beside him, already fielding texts, attention miles away. They arrived at Rosario's Corner, a narrow Italian place glowing gold in the drizzle. It was the kind of restaurant David's late wife, Noah's mother, had loved. Mismatched chairs, wood-paneled walls lined with old photographs, the air rich with garlic and basil. David hadn't set foot here since the funeral. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming, almost claustrophobic. Diners laughed, forks chimed against plates, and the aroma of tomato and bread stirred memories that left Noah raw. They were led to a small table by the window, rain tapping the glass in a nervous rhythm. David ordered quickly, barely looking up from his phone. Noah could hear him scrolling, answering messages with short, clipped replies. The first bite was a disaster. Noah's fork missed his mouth. Pasta tumbled onto his lap. Red sauce splattered his white shirt, and heat climbed his cheeks, turning his skin to fire. He heard a giggle from a nearby table. Children, maybe, or adults who thought they were subtle. David didn't notice. "Just eat," he muttered, not even pausing in his typing. Noah's hands shook. He tried to find the water glass. His fingers knocked it over instead, a sharp clatter slicing through the background hum. Silence fell, broken only by the muffled apologies of the waiter. David didn't look up. Noah's chest tightened with humiliation, tears stinging behind his eyelids. All he wanted was for the floor to open up and swallow him. It was in that moment, when the world shrank to the sound of his own failure, that Noah realized someone was watching. He felt the weight of it. A gaze, but not cold or judgmental. Gentle. Patient. He risked lifting his head, blinking away the wetness he refused to let fall. From across the room, a pair of kind eyes met his. The waitress, her voice soft, almost musical, leaned in just enough to catch his attention without making him a spectacle. She didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She saw him. The dinner dragged on, David lost in the blue glow of his phone, orders coming and going. Noah barely touched his food, appetite drowned by shame and longing. The world was blurry, unsteady. As they finished, David signed the check without a word, fingers drumming impatiently on the table. Noah wiped his face with the corner of his napkin, hoping to erase any sign of weakness. But as the rain slowed outside and the laughter inside picked up, a single hope flickered in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, not everyone saw him as invisible. Later, alone in the back seat on the way home, Noah replayed the moment in his mind. The look, the kindness, the silent message that said, "I see you." He pressed his forehead against the cold window and wished, with everything in him, that the person who'd watched him struggle wasn't just a passing shadow. Back at Rosario's, the waitress cleared their table, pausing where Noah's hands had trembled. She tucked away his uneaten bread and, for a brief moment, let her gaze linger on the rain-streaked glass, heart aching for the boy with the silent plea. Those watchful eyes belonged to Grace. Grace Miller moved through Rosario's corner like sunlight slips across a windowsill. Quiet, steady, missing nothing. At 26, she had the look of someone who'd learned to laugh with her whole face, despite 1,000 little hardships. She wore her brown hair in a messy braid, and a tired watch hugged her slim wrist, a keepsake from her late mother. Her apron was neat but faded, shoes sensible, eyes always searching for the ones left out. The dinner rush had peaked, then ebbed. But she remembered the boy at table 4, the one whose world seemed made of shadows. Grace knew that look. She'd seen it in her sister Lily after their father left. She'd seen it in herself after the eviction notice, after hospital visits, after every bill that threatened to pull them under. Tonight, though, it was in the face of a child with careful hands and a heart that clearly ached for gentleness. When Grace saw the mess on Noah's shirt, the way his shoulders hunched, she didn't hesitate. She crouched beside him, lowering herself to his level, not to fix, not to scold, but to share space. "Hey, want to try something?" she said, voice warm, threading humor through the moment like a lifeline. "Let's make your plate a clock. The chicken's at 6 o'clock, pasta at 9, broccoli at 12. Now take a bite from 3 o'clock, right there. See?" Noah blinked, surprise flickering over his features. He felt the gentle guidance of her hand on the edge of the plate, heard the smile in her words. Hesitantly, he tried, his fork finding pasta at 9 o'clock. The taste was nothing special, but the victory was electric. For the first time in months, he laughed, a small, unguarded sound, bright as glass catching light. Grace's smile widened. She didn't rush him. She asked if he liked the sauce, told him how the chef always added extra basil. She described the color of the bread, golden with a little sunburn at the edges, and let him touch it, squeeze it, understand food through senses other than sight. To everyone else, it looked like a waitress just doing her job. But to Noah, it was a doorway opening. David, across the table, was so deep in numbers and notifications that it took a full minute for the laughter to break through. The sound startled him. Noah's laugh, light and real. David's head jerked up, phone forgotten, eyes locking on a scene he hadn't witnessed in over a year. His son smiling, shoulders uncoiled, talking to a stranger like he'd known her forever. Grace met David's gaze with steady calm, not deference. There was no flattery, no awkward apology for intruding. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement between two people who both knew loss, but wore it differently. Then she turned back to Noah, letting the world around them fall away. Time felt suspended, the usual restaurant clatter fading under the spell of a single, gentle connection. The rest of the meal, Noah ate more confidently. He still missed, still spilled a bit, but now he grinned when he did, catching the edge of Grace's encouragement. When she had to serve another table, she winked. "Clock method, you've got this." And Noah found himself holding on to her words like a talisman. David watched all this with a strange ache in his chest. He realized, with something like horror, that he'd spent a fortune on therapists and tutors, and none of them had reached Noah the way this young woman had in just a few minutes. After the meal, as Grace cleared their plates, she leaned down one last time. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered, soft enough that only Noah could hear. "And you're not alone, okay?" Noah nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. His fingers closed around his napkin, heart fluttering with hope he hadn't felt in so long. David watched, stunned. The smile he could never buy. Here it was, freely given by a stranger. The restaurant was emptying, chairs scraping against tile as the last few customers filtered out into the rainy night. David Carter watched the waitress move through the shadows, her braid swinging as she wiped down tables and stacked plates with the quick, practiced hands of someone for whom time was always money. He'd been rich for so long, he'd forgotten the discomfort of gratitude. Now, it burned in him, raw and awkward. All his life, appreciation meant a bonus or a tip, money as stand-in for connection. So when Grace returned to their table for the check, David did what he always did. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp 100, then another. He placed the bills on the table, sliding them toward her with a faint nod. "Thank you," he said, voice stiff, unused to real vulnerability, "for helping Noah." Grace paused. The restaurant's old chandelier cast gentle halos of light across her face, catching the flicker of weariness in her eyes. but also something unbreakable. She glanced at the money, then back at David, not with offense, no, but with a steady calm that surprised him. "That's not necessary, sir," she said, gently pushing the bills back. Seeing him smile, "That's more than enough." Her refusal landed with a strange weight. David, master of negotiations, was speechless. No one ever refused his money. Not suppliers, not clients, not even his own employees. It left him feeling exposed, as if someone had glimpsed the hollow behind his success. "You should take it," David insisted, voice lowering. "It's not—" She shook her head, quiet but firm. Tonight, it wasn't about the money. He needed a little kindness. We all do sometimes. Noah, silent through all of this, sat with his hands folded in his lap, trying to memorize the moment. The feeling of being seen, the warmth of her attention, the gentle way she'd reframed his world. He wanted to thank her, but words stuck in his throat. Grace turned to Noah, and for a second, the world shrank to just the two of them. "You keep practicing that clock method," she whispered. "It works for more than just pasta." Noah grinned, cheeks flushed. David saw it. The glow of connection, the subtle confidence that hadn't been there before. Something twisted in him, a longing he'd tried to bury under spreadsheets and stock tickers. For the first time, he wondered what it might feel like to give Noah more than comfort and security, to give him joy. As they stood to leave, David tried once more, folding the bills and slipping them under a coffee mug, as if hiding them would make the gesture less transactional. But Grace noticed. She placed the money back in his hand, fingers cool and steady. "Don't worry," she said softly. "You've already paid." The words followed David and Noah out into the wet Chicago night, echoing louder than any thank you ever could. In the car, silence reigned, but it was no longer the oppressive, heavy kind. Noah pressed his hand to the window, the world outside blurring into streaks of city light and possibility. That night, as the rain pattered on the penthouse glass, David couldn't sleep. He wandered through his rooms, past expensive art and silent technology, haunted by the sight of Grace's calm defiance. For the first time in years, money felt useless, a blunt instrument in a world that required delicacy. He stood in Noah's doorway, watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's breath, remembering the laughter that had filled the restaurant. The one thing he couldn't buy. One name echoed through his mind, refusing to let him rest. Grace Miller. Morning broke over Chicago, gray and uncertain. David Carter, usually a force of nature by sunrise, lingered at his desk, eyes tracing the city skyline as if searching for a code he couldn't crack. His phone buzzed with requests, meetings, interviews, investment pitches, but he kept circling back to last night, to the girl with the steady gaze who refused his money. Restless, David called in his assistant. "I want you to look into Grace Miller," he said, voice measured, "but nothing invasive. Public information only. Employment, education. That's all." His assistant understood. David's reputation was built on control, not scandal. Within hours, a slim file appeared on his desk. Grace Miller, age 26, no criminal record. 2 jobs. Rosario's Corner by night, a copy shop on weekends. She'd once been a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, fine arts, painting. Dropped out after her sophomore year. The reason? Her mother's illness, medical debt piling up. Grace had left her dream behind to work full-time, supporting both herself and her younger sister, Lily, now a junior at Northwestern on a partial scholarship. David turned the pages slowly, piecing together a life stitched with sacrifice. There were no red flags, no hidden agendas, just lines of raw, honest struggle. Tucked between work schedules and faded student transcripts was a printout from an old, nearly forgotten blog. He read the line twice, letting it sink in. Family has to be the masterpiece. Everything else is just background. David set the file down. For a long time he sat in the silence of his glass tower, rain whispering against the windows, trying to understand the shape of someone who gave so much without asking for anything in return. In the world he knew, value was measured in numbers and contracts, in equity and leverage. But Grace's currency was different, something he'd spent years forgetting how to hold. He wanted to help. That much was clear. But how? Every solution he imagined sounded like charity, or worse, a transaction. He thought about offering to pay Lily's tuition, about anonymously covering the family's medical bills. He imagined scholarships, checks, even a job at one of his foundations. But every scenario ended the same. Grace's clear eyes, steady and proud, refusing to be bought. The phone rang. David ignored it. For once, the city's pulse moved without him. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching a streetcar rattle past, people moving through rain with umbrellas and shopping bags. Ordinary, unremarkable, and for that reason, precious. The file sat open beside his computer, taunting him with its simplicity. A life of invisible labor. A woman who worked double shifts so her sister could paint a brighter future. The irony wasn't lost on him. How a billionaire could envy a waitress's strength. He whispered almost without thinking, "Someone who gives everything. How do I give back without making her feel bought?" Noah padded quietly into the study, sensing the shift in the air. He didn't ask what troubled his father. He'd learned long ago not to expect answers. But as David watched his son trace a finger along the edge of the desk, he felt a pang of longing, sharper than any business defeat. He wanted Noah to see him, not as a provider, but as a father who tried, even when he didn't know how. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, David sat in the dark with the city lights winking below. Grace Miller's words, about family, about masterpieces, echoed in his mind, stubborn as hope. He closed the file and shut his eyes, making a silent promise. Next time, he'd do better. He'd find a way to give without taking away her dignity. And maybe, just maybe, he'd learn to repair the things money couldn't touch. Days passed, but Grace Miller lingered in David's mind like a stubborn melody. Every room of the penthouse still echoed with absence. Noah's careful steps, the hollow tap of David's own shoes, the silent ghost of a woman who'd once brought light to them both. Work could no longer crowd out what had begun to change inside him. On Friday, just before the dinner rush, David returned to Rosario's corner. He was out of place here, his sharp suit and cool air cutting through the warmth and laughter of families, couples, tired servers. Grace saw him the moment he entered, her hands tightening around a tray. She wondered if he'd come to complain, or perhaps to offer another tip she'd have to refuse. Instead, David waited until she was free, then asked quietly for a table, alone. The owner, a round-bellied man with thick glasses, watched with interest from the bar. David didn't order food. Instead, as Grace filled his water glass, he spoke. "I have a proposal. Not a job, exactly, and not charity, I want to hire you as Noah's companion. Not a nurse, not a tutor. He's had those. I need someone to help him experience the world again. I don't want to buy your time. I want to give my son something real. Grace set down the glass, taken aback. The words caught her off guard, not because of the offer, but the vulnerability she heard behind it. For a moment she considered all the reasons to say no. She barely scraped by as it was, working double shifts for her sister's tuition. Besides, what did she know about rich people's loneliness? But then she remembered the boy's hands fumbling for his fork, the shy smile he'd given when she described the bread as golden with a sunburn. She remembered the way he'd laughed, so rare, so desperately needed. Before she could answer, a small voice chimed from behind. "Please," Noah whispered, his hand reaching for hers across the table. Grace startled, glancing down. He was trembling, hope and fear written in the angle of his shoulders. David watched this, silent and tense. He realized that the outcome mattered more than any business deal he'd ever closed. This was not about winning. It was about not failing again. Grace's heart shifted. She placed her hand gently over Noah's. "All right," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "But on one condition. When you're with Noah, you put away your phone. No emails, no calls, no distractions. He gets your full attention. Otherwise, I can't help." The demand landed like a challenge. David, unaccustomed to being told what to do, hesitated. He glanced down at the device that ruled his days, the lifeline to his empire. But Noah's face was lifted, his sightless eyes wide, lips parted with anticipation. "For him, I can do that," David said quietly. He set the phone aside, as if relinquishing armor. A hush seemed to settle over the table. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of her own decision. She would be paid, enough to ease some burdens, but not so much that it became a golden cage. More importantly, she would get to give something Noah needed, and she had always longed for herself, a little hope, a sense of belonging. "Then let's begin," she said. And for the first time since her mother's illness, she allowed herself to believe that sometimes life did hand out second chances. The owner watched from the bar, eyebrows raised. David Carter, king of cold steel and high finance, accepting someone else's terms? He grinned to himself, suspecting something remarkable was about to unfold. For the first time, David Carter let go of control, and Grace, against all odds, stepped forward. The days that followed were unlike anything Noah or David had ever known. Grace arrived at the penthouse each morning with a tote bag slung over her shoulder, packed with objects that made no sense to a billionaire. Soft modeling clay, herbs from her own window box, battered audiobooks, tiny bells, textured paints, and once a loaf of bread she'd baked herself. Noah's world began to change. With Grace's encouragement, he molded clay animals and painted with his fingers, blending textured colors that only his hands could see. She described each color as a sound, a smell, a feeling. Blue was cold and smooth, like river stones. Yellow was soft and warm, like sunshine through bakery glass. The apartment, once silent and icy, slowly filled with laughter, messes, and the gentle chaos that marked the presence of life. Grace led Noah outside whenever the weather allowed. Together they wandered the park, Noah clutching her elbow as birds called overhead. Grace taught him to listen for the song of a cardinal, the flutter of wings, the wind in sycamore leaves. They stopped in the market. Noah learning to recognize cinnamon and basil by scent, strawberries by touch, peaches by their fuzz. And David, awkward, out of practice but sincere, found himself drawn in. He rolled up his sleeves, helping Noah knead pizza dough in the kitchen. He tripped over his own shoes at the park, but kept coming back. He even managed to tell Noah a story before bed, fumbling through the plot, voice rough, but the effort genuine. Noah began to trust again. His walls, built so high after the accident, softened each time Grace and David found something new to share. The penthouse shifted. Stuffy rooms opened to sunlight. Music from Grace's old phone drifting down the halls, the scent of cookies baking in the air. The staff, once silent and invisible, began to smile. Even the building's doorman started saving jokes for Noah, delighted by the boy's shy but growing confidence. But as warmth and color returned to the Carter home, a shadow crossed the threshold. It arrived on a Friday, in the form of Margaret Hale, David's late wife's older sister, guardian of the family's charity and keeper of old wounds. She swept into the penthouse in pearls and icy perfume, lips pinched, eyes scanning the transformation with undisguised skepticism. She saw Grace laughing with Noah over a spilled bowl of popcorn and pursed her lips. "David, a word," Margaret demanded, voice slicing through the room like frost. They retreated to the study, the door left slightly ajar. Margaret wasted no time. "You're allowing a waitress to run wild in your home? She's not family. She's not qualified. This," she gestured toward the laughter echoing down the hall, "is chaos. It's unprofessional." David, for the first time, did not bow to her scorn. "Noah is smiling again," he replied, voice calm but final. "That's worth more than order." Margaret's expression tightened. "You're too sentimental. People will take advantage, especially people like her." David stood, his patience fraying. "Grace is here because she cares. That's more than I can say for most." In the hallway, Grace overheard every word. Her hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady for Noah's sake. She knew the shadow of suspicion Margaret carried, and she knew that nothing about her own life would ever look perfect on paper. That evening, as the city lights came up outside, Grace tidied the living room, feeling Margaret's gaze sharp on her back. She met it with a quiet defiance, refusing to let old fears drown the new joy she'd found here. For now, the warmth held, but storm clouds were gathering. Noah could sense it, the same way a blind boy senses when the air in a room goes cold. Storm clouds gathered outside as the Carter penthouse slipped back toward its chill. Margaret Hale's presence was like a cold draft in every room. She watched Grace's every move with hawk-like suspicion, her clipped heels echoing down the hallways, as if to remind everyone who truly belonged here, and who did not. For days, Margaret inserted herself into every moment. She scrutinized the grocery lists, the receipts, the boxes Grace carried for Noah's projects. She questioned Grace's credentials, hinting that perhaps it was time for a proper therapist, her tone dripping with false concern. David grew tense, trying to shield Grace from his sister-in-law's scrutiny without igniting a war. He caught himself hesitating before defending Grace, his old habits of distrust surfacing like bruises. Noah noticed too. The laughter faded from his voice, and he began to ask Grace in a whisper if she was in trouble. One Thursday afternoon, as rain pattered the city in sullen gray, the household was thrown into turmoil. Margaret burst into the living room, clutching an empty velvet box. Her voice, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the air. "The sapphire pendant is missing. My sister's necklace. Gone." David appeared in an instant, his face a storm of confusion and fear. He had never cared for the pendant, a family relic locked away after his wife's death, but Margaret's accusation hung heavy, thickening the air. The staff froze. Noah, hearing the raised voices, clung to Grace's hand. Margaret's eyes narrowed on Grace. "You were the last one near the study. You're always wandering where you shouldn't. It wouldn't be the first time an outsider." "That's enough, Margaret." David's tone was low, but Grace saw the flicker of doubt cross his eyes. Margaret pressed forward, relentless. "Search her things, David. If you care about your son's safety, you'll do it." Grace's hands curled into fists. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, but her throat closed. She looked at Noah, who stood beside her, trembling. "You believe me, right?" she whispered, voice breaking. Noah squeezed her hand. "Of course I do." David hesitated, torn between the woman who had brought life back into his home and the family legacy Margaret wielded like a weapon. The silence dragged out, Margaret's glare growing colder, more triumphant by the second. "Grace, open your bag," David said quietly, not meeting her eyes. A hush settled over the room. With shaking hands, Grace knelt and opened her canvas bag, revealing nothing but children's books, paints, and a handful of receipts. No sapphire, no velvet box. She turned the bag upside down, scattering her meager possessions across the carpet for everyone to see. Margaret's lips curled, but the evidence was gone. For a moment, the only sound was Noah's ragged breath, the rain hammering the windows. "I would never take anything from you," Grace said softly, pain sharpening each word. "Not for all the jewels in the world." But suspicion, once planted, spreads like a stain. The staff exchanged glances. David looked away, wrestling with regret and guilt. Grace gathered her things in silence, fighting to keep her composure. Margaret stood tall, icy satisfaction etched into every line of her face. That night, Noah lay awake in bed, listening to the heavy hush that had fallen over the penthouse. Grace's voice, once bright and sure, now echoed with hurt. The warmth she'd brought was slipping away, replaced by doubt and cold. In the darkness, Noah made a silent promise. He wouldn't let Grace leave without a fight. The next morning dawned leaden and heavy. The Carter penthouse, once full of light, now seemed darker than ever. Grace moved through her tasks like a ghost, her smile stretched thin, her voice brittle with pain. Every staff member's glance felt like a judgment, every room colder for the absence of trust. David kept his distance. He buried himself in work, but the silence that had once protected him now echoed with Grace's words. "You want to believe me, but your fear won." It was true. He'd wanted to trust her, but the risk felt too great. He'd let Margaret's suspicion infect him. Now the cost was everywhere, in the hush that followed Grace from room to room, in Noah's sullen withdrawal, in the way the house itself seemed to mourn. Noah, usually so patient, finally broke. As Grace packed up her bag at the end of the day, eyes red from unshed tears, Noah exploded. "Dad, you always think the worst of people. You ruined everything." His fists clenched at his sides. "She's the only one who made me feel like I was more than just a problem. Now you've chased her away." David stood there, stunned by the force of his son's anger. For the first time, he truly saw Noah, not as someone fragile, but as a boy desperate for connection, desperate to keep from losing someone else. Grace knelt, taking Noah's hands in hers. "It's okay, Noah," she whispered. "Some people carry too much hurt to trust. Sometimes even the best people make mistakes." She met David's eyes, her own filled with heartbreak. "I wanted to believe in this place, in you, but I can't stay where I'm not trusted." She stood, shouldering her battered canvas bag, and walked out. The sound of the door closing was final, a blade through what little warmth remained. Night fell hard and fast. Margaret lingered in the study, a look of cold satisfaction on her face. But as she reached into her purse for her keys, a slip of velvet tumbled out. The missing pendant clattered onto the desk. The housekeeper gasped. Margaret froze. The truth unraveled quickly. The security cameras, checked at last, showed Margaret slipping into the study alone after hours, her movements furtive. Records from the charity fund revealed she'd been embezzling for months, covering her tracks with suspicion and misdirection. Confronted by David, she tried to bluster, but there was no denying what the footage made clear. He banished her from the penthouse, freezing her out of every family trust and charity. But the victory was hollow. Noah barely spoke, the pain of losing Grace etched deep. David stared at the city lights, unable to escape the consequences of his own doubt. He had done what was right, too late to fix what mattered most. That night, David found himself standing outside a weathered apartment building on the city's edge. He clutched a ring of keys to a small art studio he'd bought quietly, hoping Grace might find solace there. The lights were off inside her window. The world, for a moment, felt as empty as his own heart. He stood there in the rain, water running cold down his face, rehearsing words he'd never learned how to say. Apologies, promises, confessions. He realized at last that what he wanted from Grace wasn't gratitude or even forgiveness. It was a second chance for all of them. Inside, Grace sat by her window, watching the storm, her heart raw but not yet closed. She wondered if hope was foolish, or if, just maybe, someone could reach her through the darkness. David raised his hand to knock, not sure what would come next, but knowing the first step had to be his. For a long moment, neither Grace nor David spoke. The rain softened against the window, the city's usual roar a gentle hush. Finally, Grace opened the door, her guard still up, but her eyes searching his face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. David looked smaller than before, as if the weight of everything he'd built had finally settled on his shoulders. He offered her the keys, hands shaking. "It's not charity," he said. "It's not a thank you. It's a beginning, if you want it." Grace hesitated, the silence stretching. "Why?" she whispered. "Why now?" He drew a breath, struggling with the words. "Because I was wrong. About you. About what matters. You saw my son when I couldn't. You gave him life again. And you taught me that love is something you show, not something you owe. I don't want you as an employee. I need you as family, both of you. If you'll still have us." Something inside Grace melted. She remembered every tired night, every dollar saved for Lily, every morning she'd convinced herself to keep going. Now, in David's eyes, she saw a man finally willing to risk everything, his pride, his certainty, his fortress of solitude, for something real. "I'm not perfect," she said quietly. "Neither is Noah. And you, You have a lot to learn." David's smile was sad but hopeful. "We'll learn together." Grace glanced at the keys, then at David. "Only if it's all of us. No secrets. No more walls." He nodded, relief mixing with gratitude. All of us. Messy, real, and whole. That weekend, the studio came to life. Grace, Noah, and David stood side by side, hands covered in paint, splattering color across a blank canvas. Laughter bounced off the high ceilings. Windows thrown open to the world outside. For the first time, the Carters and Grace felt like a family shaped not by blood or fortune, but by choices and second chances. The penthouse was never perfect, but the colors never faded again. Margaret was gone, the doors open only to those who brought warmth and truth. Noah's confidence grew, his laughter ringing down the hallways. Grace's art flourished, her hope returning in brushstrokes and gentle smiles. And David, still learning, still awkward, showed up every day. Phone off, sleeves rolled, heart open. One evening, as they finished a painting, Noah traced the swirl of yellow with his finger. "It feels like sunlight," he said, wonder in his voice. Grace smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "That's what family is, Noah. Sunlight, no matter how dark it gets." With me, this isn't just a story about a waitress and a billionaire. It's proof that unconditional kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. If you have someone who believes in you, even when you doubt yourself, hold them tight today. If this story made you smile or tear up, share it with someone who could use a little hope. Comment your favorite moment below and subscribe to join us for more stories that remind us kindness is still alive.